Welcome to episode 8 of the In the Name of Service podcast. Today's interview is with Jon Dodson. Jon is the CEO of Pivot Project Development, a company whose purpose is to develop beautiful projects that promote human flourishing, create shared value for their stakeholders, and have an enduring impact on their communities. I had the great opportunity to grow up with Jon in Stillwater, Oklahoma. From the time I met him in 6th grade, he has stood out for being radically kind, thoughtful, brave, and generous. As a young man, he set an example of loving the unloved and standing up for the underdog. The work he's doing today may be more complex, yet it speaks of similar characteristics as evidenced by his company's values of empathy, resilience, excellence, thoughtfulness, and my personal favorite, joyful disruption. In today's conversation, Jon takes us through his own story, highlighting some of the pain he has experienced and how those experiences have impacted how he shows up today. Too often, we see examples of individual discomfort, pain, and tragedy, leading to a self-focused perspective in life, looking out for number one, as they say, putting up walls and keeping others out. This is not the story you'll hear today. Jon's life is an example of being grateful for every experience and believing that they are producing in you the capacity to serve others in a unique way. His story is proof that you can serve others by creating relationships outside of your comfort zone and allowing them to help you increase in wisdom, no matter your background, skills, or profession. I hope this conversation helps you reflect on your own experiences to this point and how they have been used to mold you into a powerful tool for good works. For more information on Pivot Project Development, East Point, Restore OKC, or Urban Land Institute, check out the show notes. Thank you for listening. Welcome to the In the Name of Service podcast, Jon. Walk us through your story thus far. Tell us how you got to be at the place you are in life today. And I know that's a big question.
Well, that is a very big question, but thank you so much for letting me be on. And it's funny, I don't think we've seen each other in over 20 years, but it's fun to be on the podcast, and I appreciate you asking me to be on here. So where I'm at today is probably, there's a lot of different ways to answer it, but professionally, I think the easiest way, I went to Oklahoma State University, graduated in 2003, 2004, and moved to Oklahoma City and was in banking and kind of got out of banking and then got back into banking and really spent my mid-20s to mid-30s in the banking industry, lending money. And it was in 2007 that I got involved with a group called Urban Land Institute. And that was the first time I started learning about kind of this idea that there's this lady, she's a Catholic and mystery writer, and she said that we're most godlike when we create order out of chaos. And so as I was in the banking world and I started finding ways that people could develop within communities and make a difference, it was like the first time probably my professional career made sense. It was like, oh, okay, like I can actually be a part of this. I'm not doing it. I'm just kind of facilitating the money. But I got really involved with kind of urban infill development as a banker. And so I did that, and it was 2013 when I kind of made a move to what I thought would be my final job as a banker, where I would retire. And they had asked me to come on and help with their lending department and really kind of drive the real estate side of it. And 3 months in, I knew I had made a mistake, but my boss walked in one day and to my assistant, he said, I was in the other room, I could hear everything. He said, if you want to keep your job, you need to have sex with me, get it on the calendar. And so that was one of those moments. And so the way that he had handled, really the culture was terrible, but that was kind of the breaking point. And so in the process of me reporting what he had said, the bank chose not to fire him. And they were, I would say they were less than gracious with my assistant.
Yeah.
And so I put my 2-week notice in and quit. And so I was 34 at the time and 33 at the time. And we had 4 kids. And so I sold my car. I moved my office, obviously, because I wasn't at the bank anymore. And I started officing out of a coffee shop. And so I had business cards that were made with the coffee shop address on it. And whenever I could close a deal or help someone close a deal, they would bring the check to the barista at the coffee shop. And so I really spent 2 years, and it was at the coffee shop that I think most of my kind of growth happened. When you're in lending, you're really around the same type of individual, and it's not bad, but I was around 55 to 75-year-old, primarily white, successful men who, had been professionally successful. And I was going to a coffee shop that was probably the most diverse coffee shop in town, whether it was the LGBTQ community or whether it was just people who were socioeconomically different than me or racially different than me. And so, there's this theory sometimes I think we want to believe that wisdom is just understanding or knowing more. But I think that wisdom is when you can figure out how to combine or marry knowledge with relationships. And so I'm always okay if someone has a different belief than me. What I think is always interesting, if you have that belief, as long as it is you have relationships with people who don't agree with you, it allows you to really kind of think through, is this a belief that matters or not? And so it was during that time that I just started getting exposed to a lot of stuff and started realizing that no matter what I did, I wanted to be in a world that was different from the world that I had spent the previous 10 years. Yeah. So I essentially then went, my buddy, who is a partner of mine, where I had lent money to whenever I was a banker, he went to my 34th birthday and he disappeared in the middle of the birthday. And I thought he left. I was kind of, pissed at him. And he comes back and he says, "Hey, I need to talk to you." And so me and one other friend of mine, he said, "Hey, I just got the Tower Theater under contract and I would like to do this together. Would you partner with me on that?" And so, at that point I was riding my bike. I would have taken, he could ask me to be a barista and I would have said yes. So the idea of being a equal partner in a development felt and was incredibly generous. And so it's really out of that partnership that Pivot Project was started.
Now we're going to talk a lot more about Pivot Project development, but before that, for as long as I've known you, you've always stood out as being radically kind. Where do you think that comes from?
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And I don't know, my sister says that I do have some assness to me. So, I do think that one of the things that I've had to process in my own story is the idea of, being a young kid and being, you can't see me, but, Dodsons really get one growth spurt in life. And so when we do, we got to hold on to it. And so, I experienced some things that as a little kid in public schools, whether, people beating you up or threatening to do that or whatever, that at the time felt really unfair. There were things that you wish you could grow and fight back or whatever. But what it did do is it allowed me to walk into a room and to understand people and to see where they were coming from. And in some ways to see if they were a threat, but in other ways to see other people who may be vulnerable or who were struggling. And so I think it bore an empathy. I'm grateful for that allowed me to want to be kind to people, especially people who don't have the same starting place as others. And so that empathy at times, empathy and kindness can lead to either being run over, or it can lead to paternalism, where you think you can fix everyone's problems. And so I probably at various times in my life swung one way or the other on that. I think one of the things that we've talked about as a company that's one of our values is, as we talk about kindness, instead of kindness being a value, we've called it joyous disruption. And it's this idea of you really can't use shame and guilt to persuade anyone to do something, but in empathy and in putting yourself in someone else's shoes, if you're so excited and so joyful about what you're getting to do, that that can be a much stronger motivator to bring people along for a good ride. And so, empathy is actually one of our core values at Pivot. And, we did that instead of kindness, because we wanted to say, people can still associate kindness with, someone's too kind, they get run over or whatever. But empathy, I think, is a really good way to say, hey, we're going to try to put ourselves in other people's shoes, because Lord knows all of our lives are hard enough. We all have trauma. We all have experiences that have shaped us for better or worse for who we are. And so trying to understand why people act the way they do, I think is really helpful, because I want people to do that with me. Whenever I'm in a bad place and reacting poorly, I hope that people give me enough grace to say, why is he acting the way that he is? So,
well, now I'm super interested in all of the other values, but before we go there, tell us the history of Pivot Project Development.
Yeah, so Pivot, we started our, 34th birthday. My buddy comes in, hands me the contract, and this was, 8.5 years ago. The three of us started Pivot. Really, we had no idea what we were doing. It was what we were redeveloping was actually an old movie theater that had turned into a porn theater that was then just vacant. It was had retail and office, and so we decided to do that. We converted it into it's a 1,000-cap music venue. There's several restaurants and bars, and we really had fun working together. And I think the reason why we liked working together was we really cared about the community, and then we want to make money, but money needs to sit underneath virtues. So the idea of just trying to make money for the sake of making money was not very attractive to any of us. And so it was really over a 5 or 6 year period that we redeveloped quite a bit of properties they're all historic, mainly historic buildings in the urban core. And we developed relationships with tenants that went into the buildings and really had a lot of fun. It was during that time that, and I can I'll jump into kind of some stuff we've done on the east side just because I think that's helpful. But it was during that time that there was a fraternity dude from Norman that got caught on a bus singing about lynching a black man. And so there was this big reconciliation event in Oklahoma City. And so one of the guys behind me, he was a pastor in town. He stood up and he said, if you want to know what it's like to be in my shoes, when's the last time you had someone like me over for dinner? And so I started thinking about it, and I journal fairly regularly, and I have really for the last 20 years, but I don't really journal at night. But that night I went home, and it was a really pathetic plea, but I said, dear God, let me have a black friend, because I didn't have any, right? I'd been in banking for so long. All of my friends were white, and I really didn't know anybody. And so it was over kind of this process of 2 to 3 years of really trying to be intentional, that I had some friends take me under their wing. And it's, we forget what it's a burden, because every time they meet a white person like me that is trying to understand, what's white privilege like, what's, what are these microaggressions that they experience that I don't, what's it like, they're almost, not only they have to experience that, but then they have to teach every white person what it's like. And so the kindness they gave me to basically put me under their wing, and I gave them, full authority over dude, when I say the wrong thing, just call me out. And so there was a lot of things that I would say or ask or didn't understand that they would be like, you can't say that. Do you understand what you mean? And so as that started happening, we realized that, hey, what if we actually try to develop, because we're developers, what if we try to develop on the east side of town, and what would that look like if we did that, and how could we do it different? And so we basically created kind of a somewhat incidental, but somewhat through processes. It was, how do we do the opposite of what most people do when they go into underserved communities?
And what is that?
Yeah, so typically what happens is there is a fundamental belief that because someone has access to power or money, they are a blessing to a community. That's paternalistic, but I think it's also wrong. None of us, money is not something we can take with us beyond the grave. And so the people who have community and family, that have character, that have ingenuity, people that have, friends, that good food, like all of these things, but it's like within a community, those are things that I think we all want, right? And a lot of times the white, or, I say white community, but I would say, those in power, we, the allure of wealth is that it will remove from you pain or discomfort, right? And so the only way I know how to describe it is it's like if you keep building walls, if you use wealth to build up walls, you really do eliminate anything from ever being able to get in. But that also means that you don't allow joy to get in. And I think joy and suffering are siblings that when you cancel out one, you typically cancel out the other. And so if even if you talk to like an opioid addict or something, it's not that they were taking it to feel good, but what happened was they no longer can feel anything, right? And so wealth has this weird gravitational pull to do that to us. So what we said is, if we're going to develop, the first thing that we are going to believe is that we will leverage access to power or money to be a part of the community, but we're the ones who will benefit, not them. So we're going to be the ones who, it is a very selfish endeavor on our part to go develop, because we want to grow as humans. And so that was like philosophical driver number one. Number two was the thing that most people don't want to give up is power. And so, you see that, if you're using a church reference, it's like a white church that really wants to become integrated and socially aware. And so they hire a black youth pastor, right? The problem is the power dynamics never changed. And so what we said is, if we're going to bring someone in to partner, we actually have to give them authority over us. We don't, even though we're the developer and, we're guaranteeing the debt and we're doing all these things, like we have to trust someone else to have the power over us as a company. And so we brought in, he'd been a friend of mine, and a guy named Sandino Thompson. And we said, hey, will you partner with us? But this is, you get to speak for the project. You get to veto stuff you don't like. You get to tell us what you think, and we will listen and respond. And, he had been laying the groundwork in his community for 15 years for this. So, as we come in and, we're spending 2, 3, 4, 5 years working on this, this is what he had spent, most of his formative years trying to get to, was a development within his community that could spark something. So, where we went to develop, there had not been any development in that community for over 35 years. And so a lot of, what people would tell me, well, if they haven't developed in their community for, 35 years, they must not care about it. And, why are you trying to force something that, shouldn't be done? I'll get into what my response would be as I kind of share our story of what happened there. Yeah. So I think for him, it was like, he really wanted, you have to have someone to start the process, right? And so he wanted to help start it, and he wanted to do it with people that he could trust. And so he had been used as kind of a blackface for several different projects, and then not, I would say, respected in the process. And so I think it really was fundamental for him to be the lead, because it's his community, right? Like, we don't know better than him, and we still don't. And so he had a lot to teach us. So for us, as one was saying, we're going to be the benefactors in this project if we go develop. The second was saying we needed to give authority over to someone else. The next was we wanted to, it's called representative retail, but we wanted the spaces to look and feel like they belonged on the east side. The easiest thing for us was to take, 10 really successful on the west side of town and say, hey, why don't you come over here? Rent will be cheaper. You can do your thing over here. But what that really does is it wouldn't be authentic, right? Like we didn't need a white coffee shop in a primarily Black community. We needed to try to bring entrepreneurs back to a space that they could be successful and it was representative of the community. So what we did was we actually paid the community to tenant their own building. And so what that really looked like was if you had a tenant that you knew was successful and was interested in opening up in our space and they signed a lease, instead of paying a broker, we paid the community. So we cut you a consulting check and said thank you. And so we got to cut some big checks to people because they helped us, right? And so part of it was trying to say we don't know what works best here, but we're willing to pay the community to help us find the best tenants. The next thing we did was we said, when you look at gentrification, and hopefully this isn't like too abstract, but like the whole country is talking about displacement and gentrification. And I think gentrification can be a good thing and a bad thing. But when you're in underserved communities, it can lead to displacement, and displacement's really crazy because it's if you've pulled away financing and you've pulled away all of these things from a community, the community itself becomes insulated they protect each other, right? So like the person down the street's the one who helps watch your kid when you're away. 98% of the household, or it may not be that high, it's over 90% of the households in this area are single parent households. And so, they're really, the community is the thing that helps provide. And so if property values increase and someone's forced to move, they don't move, they can't just move down the street. They have to move out of the community. And usually that means to the suburbs. And so if they're moving to the suburbs, now they're totally auto-dependent. They're outside of all of their comfort and they have to drive farther to their job. And so displacement is like really scary, and it should be within that community. And so for us, what we were trying to figure out is how do we not displace our tenants? Because that's, you go to an area in any small town or any big town in America, and usually it starts with the artists and the coffee shops and the tattoo parlors, and it gets successful. And then the landlord's like, I can make more money if I kick those tenants out and bring in someone, like a whatever tenant, right? And so all of the creatives who brought the value and the energy to that building are now kicked out. They got to go somewhere else. Well, we were scared that we might get greedy in 5 years, 10 years and kick out our tenants from the building because we could go get we could get more rent from someone else. And so what we did was we told our tenants that if you sign a lease, you become a part owner in the real estate. And so we allocated 15% ownership for all of our tenants. And so what that did was that made them owners in the property and now are partners and not just a landlord-tenant relationship. So that was like fundamental for us in terms of saying, how do we not displace these people? Well, you make them partners, so you can't displace them. And then we negotiated a bunch of money with the city, and we, instead of using that to protect our own investment, we passed that on to the tenants. So the tenants got like 6 times the amount of money that they would typically get on the west side of town, and they got a 30% reduction in rent. And then the final thing we said was we will use this as a launch point to teach other people how to develop. And so there's a whole nonprofit that got started out of this project through Sandino, and they're using, they have a real estate school now. They're training up people to do this. And so on our next project we have across the street, we're actually taking some of the folks who got interested in development and then paying them to learn how to develop as we develop the next project. That's kind of the whole thing on East Point. And, it's been interesting. It's obviously the hardest project we've ever done. It's still, it's still a struggle for all of our tenants because, they're it's the first black coffee shop in the neighborhood, right? It's the first black owned pizza place that's new in the neighborhood. And so and there's been so much financial devastation to that community through redlining, and 80% of middle class wealth is derived through home ownership. And we prevented on purpose at the African American and Black community from being able to own homes. And so when you do that for 3 generations, the lack of middle class wealth is not due to anything other than we kept them from being able to do. My parents, the only wealth they have is the equity in their home. That's all they got. And so, and that's given them a lot of financial freedom over the years, whereas that just doesn't exist over there. So there's still a lot of work to do, but yeah, that's been a really important project, and it's been really helpful for us to become, I think, a different type of development company out of that.
So what for you so far has been the most rewarding on your journey of developing differently?
Yeah, so I think, we would say, there's that quote that rising tide lifts all boats, but, we've said a rising tide floods all the boats that have holes in it. And so as we look at, there's this theory that if we just keep pumping money into downtown, everybody else is going to win. But really, a lot of times it just creates greater disparity between the haves and the have-nots. And so I think for us, what has been most rewarding is it's actually learning to see the world a little differently. If you talk to someone who's anemic and they don't know they're anemic, and they're, man, I'm fine, but I'm kind of tired. I get up at 10 a.m. and I go to sleep at 6 p.m. I still don't have any, real energy. But then they get iron in their body for the first time. And they're like, oh my God, I feel so great, right? To see the world differently, to be around folks who experience different things, but also have different forms of having joy. I think for our company, it's made us totally different. And so you just see the world in a more robust way. It's like getting a new pair of eyeglasses and going, oh my God, I never knew the world was this wonderful. And so those relationships are by far the most rewarding thing that we've gotten out of this deal.
What have been the most difficult hurdles to jump over in this area of service so far?
Yeah, so, for East Point in particular, I just didn't realize how difficult it was for people to be able to get money to their community. And so when we chose to do the development phase 1, we had a healthcare clinic that was going to take 60% of this asset, and they were going to basically service all the debt. And so I started calling banks because I was like, this is going to be the easiest project we've ever done. We've got an anchor, we got a healthcare clinic they're 100 years old. They're moving their headquarters to this side of town because they believe in this mission. Who wouldn't want to be a part of phase 1, right? And I called over 25 banks and I couldn't get a term sheet. And some of the banks were honest. They said, well, we don't lend money to that side of town. And some banks said, well, if there hasn't been any development in 35 years, I don't know, why would I be the one to take that risk? And so there was a moment in time where we had a bank finally say, okay, if you bring in someone richer than you guys and they guarantee the debt and you give them ownership in the real estate, then we'll do the deal. And so I had a buddy who, he's a really wonderful guy, and he's got the largest single malt Scotch collection in the country. And so he had more single malt Scotch than we needed in debt on this project. So I call him, I tell him what we're trying to do. He's like, I'm in, man. I'll support you guys. So we go back to the bank and we say, okay, this is the guy. He's going to do it. And they called me and they said, he's not rich enough. And so at that point, it was the weight of, where I wanted to go was I wanted to call out bankers by name and call them all racist, right? And be but really what happens is in the 50s and 60s when banks really were discriminatory in nature, right? If you were Black and you came to me and you said, hey, Dodson, I need a loan, I would just say, hey, you're Black, you're not going to get my money, right? And I would say that in the 70s and the 80s, but in the 90s, things started to change in 2000s. But what happened was because we started that process 60, 70 years ago, in the 2020s, people are saying hey, I really care about the Black community, but no one's lent any money over there for 50 or 60 years. The system itself is what became the problem, right? It's not just like bankers are bad people. It's like the banking system had become the problem. And so the only way that we knew to really address that was through joyous disruption. Because I did try the shame route for a little bit and it didn't work. And it was like, yeah, I can't shame people into lending us money, but we can start talking about how great, this development is, how great the people are, who wouldn't want to be a part of this. And so I actually called a female-owned bank in Edmond, which is a suburb, and basically just laid everything out. I said, we're going to lose everything if we don't find a loan for this. And she was the one to go to bat for us and to get us the money to close. And so that didn't fix the problems. Like we had over 40 LOIs, which are called letters of intent, to move into our retail spaces. But these people, they only needed like $25,000. They'd been successful. They had businesses in other sides of town. They wanted to move back to the black side, which is where they grew up or whatever. And they could get money on the west side of town for their business. But when they came back, they couldn't get money for the east side, or they couldn't get money for their east side project. And so we only had 11 spaces and we had over 40 letters of intent signed. But these people couldn't get that little bit of money to help, right? And so there is still this like massive capital disconnect in our country, which makes it really difficult if you're a person of color to, and I would say female-owned businesses as well. Like our retail development, which is 20,000 square feet, it's 90% minority-owned businesses, and 50% of those are females. And so it's been really difficult for them to get the money they need. Where on the west side of town, it's just a lot easier. We bought the Tower Theater. I had never developed before. I had no idea what I was doing. I had no money. We had no tenants for the entire building, and we got a bank to say yes. You move 2 miles to the east, and we have a 100-year-old healthcare clinic that signed a 10-year lease, and we've gotten the city to invest in it, and I can't get a bank to say yes. And so, it's one of these things where you start saying one of these things is not like the other. And it's sad, but it is true. And so we become very passionate of saying, Pivot is a for-profit. But what we've said is we need nonprofits on the east side. We need nonprofits striving and providing value. But we also have to create an economic engine that has not existed before. So it's like you're trying to kickstart something because it's been so devastated through redlining and everything else. And so you're not going to fix 50, 60 years of this with one project. Right. And so it's going to take time and it's going to take more. So.
Well, Jon, early in our conversation, you spoke about leaving the comfort of a predictable job, selling your car, working out of a coffee shop. Practically speaking, what has sacrifice looked like for you and your family as you've gone on this endeavor?
I guess the first thing would be to say is some people are like really brave and they choose to enter into this world. They say, hey, I want to give my life to service, or I want to, I'm choosing to sacrifice for others. If I'm being honest, I was not that brave. I needed a horrific thing to happen to one of my coworkers, and for me to be really forced out of banking to get me to say, okay, now I have to survive, right? I got to pay bills. We had 4 kids. And so it's like, those are the things when I was liquidating all of our savings accounts and everything to, cover bills and all of that. I think it was something that I would not have chosen. And so, in kind of some weird way, I'm appreciative that I was forced to make a decision and that I chose to quit my job, then lean into this. But I mean, really, what does that translate to today? It's like, one, the sacrifice was a lot of long hours. Banking is pretty great. You can kind of shut it down, right? I had times where I was stressed or worried, but in the big picture, life was pretty simple and easy. And so this is way more complicated and much more. Our tenants are our friends, and, our bankers are our friends, and people who invest with us are friends. And so life gets very connected. And so that was weird, I think, for for Katie and for the kids and all of those things. But at the same time, it's just been really rewarding. So I feel like the sacrifices that have been made were well worth it. And the idea of having to go back and, work for a bank or do something like that would makes my stomach hurt, right? It's like, I don't want to go back and do that. I really love what I get to do. And I'm really grateful that I have an opportunity to do with the people that we have. And so we've got a team that is really great and that is collectively bought into this idea that we can do things differently with a long-term view in mind and do it for the community and still be financially successful and help maybe change the culture. And so, we've been intentional at Pivot with, we really were mostly female company because there's been so few developers that are female in Oklahoma City. And so instead of banging a stick and telling everyone they need to hire females, it's like, well, why don't we just really focus on hiring females? And so one of my partners is a lady named Candace Bates. And, I've watched her, I've had friends come up and before I could tell them who she was and what she did, they would be like, oh, I've got someone just like her in my office, right? And the assumption that because she's a female, she's, an admin assistant or whatever. And so each one of the females in our team, have had to overcome so much more than I have, right? As much as I had to, we had to kickstart, I'm still a white dude who has a lot of access and privilege that I don't deserve, but I still get it. And so us being able to change how development is viewed, even within Oklahoma City, has been really fun because we're getting to disrupt the system by hiring really qualified females and changing the narrative. And the females on our team are really awesome and they're really, really good at what they do. And so I think those are things that you're like, man, had we not been on this journey, had we not seen and experienced the things that we did, we wouldn't be looking at trying to build a company the way that we are.
Definitely. Well, let's say there's someone near you in Oklahoma City or nearby, and they'd like to contribute to this effort. What does that look like? What other resources do you need to stand alongside you? Could you speak to that practically for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because my sister-in-law, she formed she started something in Oklahoma City called Restore OKC. And what they did was they moved back from St. Louis, my brother and sister-in-law did, and they were working for Restore St. Louis and started Restore OKC. But basically what Restore OKC did was it just started building relationships. They started going to the library, which was essentially the community center, and hanging out with families, asking them what they needed. And out of that, they have a workforce housing program for females who were incarcerated, who are trying to get back on their feet. They have a massive greenhouse where the kids, the high school students who work there, get a free ride to either OSU or Langston. They have, they started during one of the grocery stores on the east side, the only grocery store on the east side, got torn down by a developer and without any notice to the community. And within 6 months, this Restore group had opened up a nonprofit grocery store that had food that was be at any grocery store, but they had fundraised to basically sell it at a lower cost for the community. And so, they're fixing up houses. And so when we see them, we can't do the things that they're doing. And their world is different, right? They're working with, when I talk to them, what their days are like, it's like they're working with maybe a 70-year-old who can't fix the roof on their house. And so they're going in and doing that, right? My world is very much baked into I'm trying to connect with entrepreneurs who, which means they're the 20 to 40-year-olds that are trying to figure out, hey, I love this side of town. I had to leave to go be successful. How could I come back and do something different? And so you have to have both. You can't have, if you just had Pivot, I think you would create gentrification so quickly that the community would lose its soul, because it would get displaced. Whereas you have to, but at the same time, you have to have economic growth, right? You have to have economic viability. You have to have the ability to make money. And that's been one of the things that we feel like we can help with.
How might you advise someone going or moving in the same or similar direction as you, possibly in a different community, knowing what you know now?
I really think the idea of building relationships. I've had friends tell me like, man, like, I love what you've done, but I don't really know how my skill set would parlay into that. And I don't think, if you would have asked me 7 years ago, what would my skill set parlay to into the East Side, I would tell you I have no idea. It was actually driving around on the East Side with my friends who are Black and then talking about what their dreams were. And at some point it clicking and going like, oh, hey, I think we could actually like be a part of this, right? Like, I actually have some things that I do that might actually parlay into what you want to see happen. And maybe we could do that together. And so I do think relationships are, our country's in a weird state, right now politically, with all of the divisiveness that's occurred and on both sides. And we've all surrounded ourselves in echo chambers where everyone else is an idiot. And I think there's something to be said about holding as much as we can into this idea of holding relationships with people who don't agree with us. Because, I've believed a lot of things over my 42 years, and I've changed political perspectives. I've changed, religious perspectives. I've changed a lot and none of us are static, right? We're all dynamic and changing. And so I do think relationships are really, for anyone who's trying to do something, it's like, go spend time. I mean, just you don't even need to have grandiose plans. I think if you build relationships, you'll see where your skill sets can lean into something in it, whether it's facilitating a line of credit for someone who's trying to start a business, to helping someone with a business plan, to working at a nonprofit and serving there, to developing. I mean, all of those things are needed, but I think they're needed for the person doing it. Like, again, you become a better person when you're a part of that.
So tell us this: what would you suggest for the person who has a heart similar to yours, maybe a heart for a specific community, but they see what you've done over the last 8.5 years with your team and it just looks too big? What would you suggest, or how would you suggest that they get started?
Well, one thing would be to say that there are people making massive impacts in communities across America. And, my specific field is development, right? And so real estate development. And so that was the most natural place for me to lean in on. But there are so many things that are needed. Again, like, start with a relationship. And then at some point, I find that people either decide to jump in. You do not get to wade into these kind of issues. It's not like, hey, I'm going to wait till, let me get knee deep and then decide. Yeah, that never works, right? And I've watched a lot of people who are really talented, who care, try to, I watched someone spend 1.5 years dipping their toes in, and then they just realized it was too complicated, and they said, I just can't do it, right? I'm not faulting that person, but I think what I have found is if you're not willing to jump in and join in and commit, it's just too difficult. There are so many headwinds that no matter what you try to do in an underserved community, there's so many headwinds there that if you're going to wait till the wind turns your direction, you're never going to do it. And so, you at some core level, you have to believe that you need it as a human, and your need for that is greater than the obstacles that you are going to face. Yeah, and it's crazy. Like, along the way, like one of my favorite stories was JB, who is he's a social developer, a community developer. He's a rapper. He's really talented in so many different ways. He's also an entrepreneur. He owns a pizza place in town. But he called me one day and he's like, "Hey, I need you to come over to East Point, which is our project on the East Side." And so I drove over there and I was like, "What's up?" And he's like, "We just need to go for a walk." And so we walk over to this building, and it's this nondescript building, and it just says barber on it. And so we walk in, and it's three dudes playing NBA 2K, and then a guy getting his hair cut, and then the barber, who's probably like 6'4", no body fat on him. And he's got one picture on the wall, and it's a picture of JB, my friend. And so, like, JB starts talking to him, and they're chat. And so then this guy starts grilling me. I have no idea who he is. I have no idea what's going on. But he starts asking me what I'm trying to develop next to him, what I think about the community, what I'm wanting to provide to the community, why I would even do this here. And at the very end, he goes, okay, you're cool, man. You're good. And I leave and I tell JP, I'm like, what the hell just happened, man? I have no idea what we just walked into. And he's like, well, he's the mailman and he's made. And I'm like, he's made? What do you mean? I'm still very much trying to learn this at this point. And he's like, oh, he's the OG. I'm like, okay, I like original gangster. What does that mean? And he's like, well, he was in a gang in LA. He moved here and he's basically, I took you to him so that he would protect your property and make sure that nothing happened to it. And it was at that point that I realized JB had gone and sacrificed for me in a way that he knew he couldn't tell me beforehand what he was asking me to do. But at the same time, had I messed that up, all of JB's reputational, like that would totally damage his reputation. And so as you start seeing the way that people are willing to be kind to you in a way that you don't deserve, I left there so humbled. I was like, I can't believe he just did that for me when he didn't have to. I never would have known. I never would have like gone into that barber shop, right, and been like, this is the guy I need to know. But not only did he connect me, he stood by my side to make sure that that thing was taken care of. And so those are the kind of things that shape who you become when you choose to just jump in.
I love that. Well, let's wrap it up there, Jon. I just want to say thank you for your time today, and also thank you for everything you're doing in your community.
Thank you so much.